Cipher Brief expert Glenn Korn is joining us now from Kyiv, and Glenn, of course, served as a senior officer at the CIA, working in the clandestine division of the CIA for much of his career. Glenn, it's nice to see you. Thanks for joining us from Kyiv today.
Hi, Suzanne. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you.
You've been on kind of a whirlwind tour, not your first, but you've been on a pretty intense tour these last few days. A lot of the bombings have intensified. Russia is not holding back on its attacks against Ukrainian cities. Can you just talk to us a little bit, Glenn, about where you've been and what you've seen?
Yeah. Well, we went in, came across the border, went to Lviv, spent some time in Lviv. Then we went to Odessa, spent a day and a half in Odessa, about a day in Odessa, and then
Odessa down south near the Black Sea, where there's a lot
yeah,
of Russian activity there
to
too,
the
right?
port, right? Just before we got there, the day before, they got hit pretty hard again. Mikhailsk, which is not far from Odessa, and now we're back in Kiev. So for the YES conference.
Yeah, and the attacks have really been intensifying, as I mentioned. You've witnessed part of that. Talk to me a little bit about the effect that those bombings are having on the psyche there in Ukraine. It felt desperate when I was there with you in May. It must feel incredible now.
Yeah, Suzanne, we were in Lviv for 2 days, then we drove to Kiev for a night to cut up the, you have to drive everywhere. You can't take a plane, given the air threat. So we stayed overnight in Kiev, and we were woken up in the morning about 6 a.m. with strikes inside of Kiev by the Russians, including one strike which damaged the Council of Ministers building downtown. I think the Russians are claiming that was not deliberate, which is interesting because for we've talked about this before, how the Russians have been deterring the West. But it tells me something when the Russians are very quick to say that they were not behind something, because that tells me they're worried about the response.
There were folks who died, I believe, in those attacks that happened at the same night that the Cabinet of Ministers building was hit, Glenn. And the intensity. I mean, the numbers. I think I've seen estimates between 700 and 800 drones.
Yeah.
We've seen incredible, missile attacks.
Yes.
And this is not new. It was like this when we were there a few months ago too. But I'm just wondering, like, is it wearing on people differently now? Is it having more of an effect? The air defenses in Kyiv are certainly getting drawn down.
Right. Suzanne, the Ukrainians are incredibly resilient. And honestly, I'm not seeing that they're cowed by these attacks. I'm sure people are like upset. And I think 2 days ago, the Russians hit a group of pensioners that were at a post office to get their pension checks, killed a group of civilians, I think 20 plus. People respond to that. They're angry about that. The main thing I'm hearing and seeing is they're waiting for the Western response. What is the West going to do? We've given Putin a chance to negotiate a ceasefire, a way out of this disastrous war, and he's not taking it. In fact, he's doubling down. And people here are asking, when is the West, including the United States, or maybe led by the United States, going to respond? And I think many Americans are probably asking the same question.
That's been a question for a long time. Let me get into that with you a little bit, Glenn, because now we're seeing some signaling from Russia that if in fact the U.S., if Ukraine rather uses long-range weapons, long-range missiles that were provided by the West to attack, and Ukraine has had some success in the past attacking inside of Russia to try to bring some of this fear into Russia that Russia has been wreaking on Ukraine for all of these years now. If that happens, that Russia feels it will be able to attack Western cities. There's a lot of saber rattling. We've heard this before. That's not necessarily anything new. But it was one of the things, too, the nuclear threat that really deterred the Biden administration from taking a more aggressive approach and giving Ukraine the support it needed right up front. What do you think needs to happen now, Glenn, in order for that deterrence to really kick in against President Putin?
I think we need to go back and let's just go back to the history to 2022. The Russians drew several red lines. Finland, NATO, joining NATO, red line. They were going to, respond against the West. They didn't do that. If we gave the Ukrainians ATACMS, F-16s, that could result in a tactical nuclear response. They didn't do that. I think there are a lot of threats that are coming from the Kremlin. It's easy for me to say, of course, because I'm not sitting in the White House, but I think that, those threats are designed to deter us from making decisions or doing things. If we talk about the deep strike capability, the Ukrainians are doing that on their own. My own view is, and based on some of the things we've heard from some of the Ukrainians we've spoken with, they don't need that as much as they need like a mid-strike capability, because the information that we heard is that the Russians are preparing for another large-scale offensive in the next couple of weeks, maybe in less than a week. And the Ukrainians are going to have to be able to strike the logistics points, the collection points for Russian troops if the Russians try and mass forces along the front to strike at any particular part of the front lines. And we all know the Ukrainians are stretched personnel wise, and so having that capability, I think, would be very valuable. But obviously, that's a strategic decision up to Kiev. And if they, my own view is we should give the Ukrainians the weapons they need, and they should be able to use them as they need to defend themselves and to stop this Russian onslaught. And if it means striking a Shahid factory deep inside of Russia, or a factory where they're producing these Kinjal missiles, we should do it. We should let them do it. And I don't think that Russia's going to go to nuclear war over that.
Yeah, that's always been the key kind of point of hesitation. Glenn, let me ask you, Poland shot down a couple of Russian drones that it said had entered its airspace. They are calling it an act of aggression by Moscow. NATO did actually launch some warplanes in response to this. That's concerning. It's also something similar has happened in the past too since this war started. What concerns me even more is that we're hearing now from former President Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president, accusing Finland of laying the groundwork for a NATO attack on Russia. Now, you and I like to kind of think back and remember what it was like in the early days. I remember when Russia was building up troops along Ukraine's border, saying there's nothing to see here, there's nothing to see here. And then all of a sudden, Russia came out and said that Ukraine was actually a threat to Russia. Are you concerned about what you're seeing now in Finland and some of the rhetoric that's being put out there?
Well, if we go back to even before the Second World War, the Russians used, or the Soviets, Stalin used provocation to start a war with Finland, to invade Finland, right? Medvedev, in my own view, is being used by the Kremlin to, they had Zhirinovsky in the 90s through the mid 2000s, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was used to scare the West, right? Then they had Prigozhin, who was used, in my opinion, as okay, this is what could come to power if Putin loses power, or back in the 90s, if Yeltsin loses power, you could have Zhirinovsky. That would be a disaster for the West. And people in Washington, oh God, that would be horrible. I think Medvedev is being used to some degree for that, like propaganda and deterrence purposes. I don't think what he says has much weight, and I don't think that they're going to. First of all, I'm pretty positive that Finland is not preparing to invade, or NATO is not preparing to invade Russia across the Finnish border. I think that's all hyperbole. It's designed to make excuses for some of the things they're doing, and maybe to rally support inside of Russia for a cause which my guess is doesn't have as much popular support as the Russian regime would like, especially as Russia's economic situation continues to worsen, which it is doing.
You're about to participate in a gathering in Kyiv with a lot of European leaders, a lot of influencers, folks who have been close to what's happened there since Russia launched this full scale invasion. I'm wondering what's top of mind for them now. The last time you were there at this conference was a year ago.
Yes. I will see what the discussions are. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of the speakers say, the West needs to do something. It's time to, take secondary sanctions. It'll be interesting to hear, because President Trump has come out and said he wants the Europeans to basically sanction China, stop buying oil and gas from Russia, sanction the Chinese, and sanction the Indians for buying Russian gas. Well, it'll be interesting to see what some of the discussions from the European participants in the Yes conference will be. Um, but unfortunately, I think everyone's going to be asking the question: what is the West going to do? There's been a lot of talk from Europe, right? And there's a lot of anticipating. The president, our president, has said he's as of maybe 2 days ago, that he is willing to put secondary sanctions on top of what we did to India, um, to punish Russia, or to try and force Russia to the negotiations table. So I think people are waiting to see if that's going to happen, when it's going to happen. And in my own opinion, both the Europeans and the U.S. need to do this simultaneously.
Mhm. And coordination level would be fantastic. Glenn, you, I want to put you on the spot here for just a quick second before I let you go, but you actually briefed President Trump during his first term. You were still working at the CIA at the time, but you've talked to him about Russia in the past. If you were briefing the president today after this latest trip to Ukraine, where you've seen this yourself, what would be top level for you in that brief today?
That the Ukrainians are ready for a deal. It's not the Ukrainians that are the problem. Putin is the problem. Putin is pushing as a bully would do. They're trying to bully their way to a settlement that they want, which is in favor of Moscow. And it's time for the United States to stand up to Russia. In my experience, if we do that, the Russians will be willing to negotiate in a more sincere manner. But they need to see force on the other side. And we should not let them cower us with their threats, their saber rattling, Medvedev's comments. I think if you look at past action and response, that tells you a lot. And we should look at that and learn from that.
Let me just dig in one layer deeper. The force that you're talking about that the U.S. needs to show Putin needs to come in the form of sanctions, in supplying Ukraine with more of the weapons it needs to defend itself. Like, what else? What other, what other things could be included in that show of force to Putin that you feel like might actually make a difference?
Okay, so secondary sanctions, yes. I like what the president's saying to the Europeans. Like they need to take a step too. They need to be in the shows they have skin in the game. And we like enough of the excuses that they're relying on Russian oil and gas and they can't make changes. They've got to do that because we're at the point now where we all need to do something, and it's going to be painful for everybody. Yes, I think additional provision of weapon systems, including air defense systems, which are critically needed. We talked about the long range weapon systems. We should give them the ability to use those systems the way that they need to be used when the commanders decide how they want to use it. And I would say that some of the things that maybe we're doing now also make sense to me. For example, what we're doing in the Caribbean and the message we're sending to Venezuela, we shouldn't forget that that is a Russian ally and that is a PRC ally. And so we should be putting pressure on Maduro. We should be putting pressure on any Russian ally, in my opinion, now around the world. And I've been saying this for 2+ years now. We should be showing the Russians that we're going to make them, kind of like what Ronald Reagan did with his strategy during the Cold War. We are going to challenge them wherever they challenge us, and we're going to make them have to decide where they're going to spend their very, very limited, and I have to stress that, their limited funds. They have economic problems, and we can exacerbate those problems. And it's unfortunate that we would have to do that, but we should do that because the Russians are not only challenging the Ukrainians now, they're doing things like trying to, threatening the life of European officials when they're in the air. I think the number I heard is 16 Russian drones that went into Polish territory, violated Polish airspace. There's a whole, sabotage, a whole list of things they're doing, which is very aggressive, and there needs to be responses to those things. And we need to make Russia understand that they will pay a price. There will be a significant consequence if they cross a line. And they seem to be crossing the line, so now it's time to show them the consequences. And the last thing I'll say is I wrote an article with you guys on this. I think the president needs to start messaging the Russian people directly. We, the U.S. government, need to message them directly. The president has given their leader a chance, for peace, and he's not taking it. And he should be held accountable by the people of Russia for whatever economic pain they're feeling and for whatever consequences come from policies that we're going to have to take to punish Moscow for its continued aggression against its neighbors, not just Ukraine, but other, Georgia, Moldova.
It is the Russian people who would feel the effects of those sanctions. Glenn, we're going to be sharing, for those who are on social media, we're going to be sharing, particularly on LinkedIn, some of the images that you've been taking during your trip in Ukraine at the Cipher Brief. And folks can also follow you, of course, there as well directly. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. And we wish a safe trip, a safe return back for you and your team that are visiting there this week, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Brad, and everybody at the Cipher Brief. It's great to see you. God bless you.
Likewise. Thanks, Glenn.